Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. Please use the chat function to mention your name, where you're joining us from today, and what interests you about cost effectiveness. We'll just wait for more attendees to join. And please note that throughout the session, we really want it to be as interactive as possible. So you'll see opportunities to answer polls, to ask questions through the Q&A function of Zoom. So please keep this in mind throughout. And we'll try our best to answer your questions today. So again, if you had missed it, please use the chat function to mention where you're joining from today and what interests you about cost effectiveness. All right, I see the room is filling up. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So, the premise we're working with through today is something that many of us are grappling with. We're all very aware of the changing funding landscape, and many members of our audience will actually be trying to understand what this means for their particular context. Broadly speaking, we know that there's been an increasing emphasis on demonstrating cost effectiveness for a number of years. And at EdTech Hub, we believe that evidence-based decision-making is extremely important. And we'd love to hear what you think about that through a poll that will be on your screens very shortly. So the question is, to what extent are cost cuts in education affecting how you collect or analyze cost effectiveness data? And I'm seeing the figures moving. All right, we're seeing that actually it has, to some extent, is what 40% of you today have answered. So we're hoping that our discussion today will help frame some of the questions you might have and provide opportunities for more discussion in the chat, but also an opportunity to interact with some of the questions that you're grappling with. So today, to really help us unpack this topic, we're joined on the panel by, and I realize I've not introduced myself either. So let me begin with that. My name is Hani Mazari. I work at the EdTech Hub as the Asia lead. So I oversee our country engagement portfolios across Asia. And I am joined by, I'll start with the order on my screen. I'll start with Elisabetta, if you could please introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, Annie, and hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining this panel. My name is Elisabetta Aurino, and I'm an associate professor of economics at the University of Barcelona. And my work mostly focuses on child and adolescent development. And I'm quite interested in cost effectiveness, among other things. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabetta. Lee, can I hand over to you to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a senior research fellow at the Centre for Global Development based in London, and I'm based in our education policy team, but also looking at issues across aid effectiveness and tracking the current aid cuts in particular. Thanks.
Thank you, Lee. Great to have you here today, Lee and Elisabetta. And now I'll hand over to my colleague, Joel.
Hello, I'm Joel Mitchell, and I work across EdTech Hub's research portfolio, dealing with various cross-cutting issues. And one of those main cross-cutting issues is cost effectiveness. So we've published quite a few different things on cost effectiveness analysis, looked across the sector at how different people are analyzing the effectiveness of their programs and how to choose between what is most cost effective. And so this roundtable webinar is an opportunity to gather some experts from across the field that we've enjoyed working with and reading their work to continue to sharpen our thinking around that, and also to share our thinking from within the hub. So I'll pass it back to you, Hani.
Thank you, Joel. And thank you for introducing yourselves in the chat, everyone. Please keep doing so. I see that there's, colleagues joining us from Pakistan, from the US, from Tajikistan, from many parts of the world, Cote d'Ivoire. So thank you so much for joining us across your different time zones, and really looking forward to interacting with you today. So, in case you had missed it, we were initially just talking about the changing funding landscape and the fact that many people across the world, and particularly, I'm sure many of you in our audience, will be trying to kind of grapple with what this means for their particular context. But even though this funding reality, is something we're all grappling with, there's been over the years an increasing emphasis on demonstrating cost effectiveness. So around that, Lee, I'd love to invite you to start speaking a bit about, what you've written recently and your experience of this challenge.
Great, thanst very much. So I thought I'd kick off by trying to be a little controversial and answering the question you posed as, is cost effectiveness the answer to the crisis with the aid cuts, with a resounding no, and saying cost effectiveness in EdTech is not the answer, on the grounds that, first of all, I mean, what do we mean by these? What are we talking about? It's not just the decimation of US aid and these 40% cuts to UK announced recently, but a whole raft of other donors have also announced large cuts of 20 to 30%, including France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Finland, Canada. And we don't know exactly how these cuts are going to fall yet across sectors and across countries, but I think there's a reasonable case that education may face bigger cuts than these if life-saving aid around medicines and food is going to be protected, and that implies bigger cuts elsewhere. And so this is a real crisis point for the education aid sector. And now I've written a somewhat optimistic take on these cuts, that this, there's a lot of extreme responses saying this is the end of the aid paradigm as we know it, and I don't think this is necessarily true. Aid, does go up and down over time. These cuts may take us back to where we were a decade ago or 2 decades ago, but it's not to zero. It's not that aid is disappearing. And I think what's driving these cuts underlying is this partly this sense of economic stagnation in donor countries and the cost of living crisis, but partly also a sense amongst the public that aid just isn't very effective. And I think that's clear when you look at the opinion polling. It's not that people are just selfish or don't care about people in poor countries. People do care. They just think that aid doesn't really work. That's what they hear. And they also think that the world is just getting worse in general, which is the polar opposite of reality, which is that for most people, the world is getting slightly better. They're living longer, healthier, more educated lives. And that's, largely not due to aid, because aid is such a small sum of money, but aid is generally effective and it is probably helping. And so that's not quite the same thing as cost effectiveness. That's just effectiveness full stop. Like, is it doing anything? People aren't quibbling over what the exact return on investment of aid is. The challenge is that people just think it's a complete waste of time and it's all lost to corruption and waste. And so we need to do a much better job of making the case for the effectiveness of aid to the public. And, how important is cost effectiveness in all of this? Of course, I'm a researcher and I spend a lot of my time doing the kind of analysis that goes into these calculations. Of course, we need to make sure that the money that does remain goes as far as possible and is used as efficiently as possible. So of course, we do need to be thinking about cost effectiveness. I guess one worry I have is around the way that cost effectiveness analysis is implemented is often focused on looking at pilot programs that worked really well, and then when they're scaled up, we don't see the same results. And so I think that's a really important filter that we need to add to cost effectiveness. When it comes to EdTech, my worry is that investments in EdTech require infrastructure alongside them, which is, can be expensive or hard. So there's some really interesting examples of programs out there providing personalized adaptive learning, such as, say, MindSpark in India or the 1 billion tablet program in Malawi. And in both cases, they're relying on existing infrastructure or needing to invest in new hardware and electricity, such that the per child costs aren't necessarily that low. So the NGO IRC has, I think, a really good industry-leading cost analysis, and they publish lots of information on the cost of their programs. And for their education programs, they have detailed cost estimates for 79 different programs. And of those, 4 are EdTech programs, and 3 of those 4, they're above the average cost per child of IRC education programs. So on the cost side, there are some concerns, and then there's also some concerns on the effectiveness or the benefit side. So there's always the risk that programs just don't work. So the study that I led during COVID in Sierra Leone, we evaluated a really well-designed remote one-to-one coaching intervention delivered by a high-quality implementer, and it just didn't move the needle on learning for those children at all. So however, low cost it may have been, it just didn't work. And then finally, another concern about investments in EdTech today is the rapid development of artificial intelligence. And the rate of change is just so high that I think there's a risk that the software tools being developed and tailored today will quickly become quite redundant as they're overtaken by newer technology. Where I'm most optimistic for the EdTech sector is the potential for broadcasting. So I wrote a blog on this, reviewing a systematic review of studies in EdTech. And the one intervention which has been shown to work at scale consistently is what are called telesecundarias in Mexico, and they have them in India and China as well. So it's a remote rural school where they don't necessarily have a specialist teacher, say in physics, and so they can instead just play a recording of a lesson, which is obviously not as good as a teacher, but it's better than no teacher at all. And what's important here is that you aren't just replacing the need for a school and a human presence, but you're providing a complement and not a substitute. And similarly then for out of school, there are television shows like Sesame Street or Akili and Me in Tanzania, where the scalability is built in because the marginal cost is effectively near zero. And studies show a range of positive benefits for children from these kind of programs. So yeah, I just think this point about scale is really critical, and essentially cost effectiveness is often really driven by this scale question, with marginal costs being low. Just if you can reach the adoption, then you're going to get that cost effectiveness. I spoke to one developer of an app whose board essentially said, we only care about your adoption, like just we don't care about your effectiveness, just as soon as we just need numbers. Similarly, the data from the EdTech Hub during COVID showed that whilst during COVID schools were closed for months, the usage of EdTech products was increasing rapidly. It perhaps doubled, but it was still only reaching a tiny percentage of children in Africa at the time. And so I think there's some distance to go, and I'm sure things have improved in the last 5 years, but there's still some way to go there. So overall, I think cost effectiveness in EdTech perhaps overrated in the short term, but underrated in the long term. So I think in the long term, artificial intelligence is going to change the world, and certainly the way we learn and the way we work. But I'm hoping that Elisabetta and Joel, you can give me a few more reasons for optimism now. So over to you.
Thank you, Lee, for your candor, talking about what works, also what you've observed around what hasn't worked, right? And I think one particular thing that you said really stood out around something being really effective when it was at the pilot stage, but when it came to scale up, the particular intervention was not able to demonstrate the same effectiveness. So I also like that you touched upon a number of modalities, right, including I know Gen AI, where it comes up in every session that we have, but I think it's important to consider the range, as you did, from broadcasting to Gen AI. And on that note around different modalities, I know that another one of our participants has a lot of experience with messaging. So one way that implementers and donors alike have reacted to trends around cost effectiveness and particularly working towards effective solutions for resource constrained environments, is to consider what is lower in terms of cost per child. And messaging is something that's been described as one of the lowest cost types of interventions with an impact in EdTech. And Beta, you've worked a lot in this area, so I'd love to hear some of your reflections from your work in Ghana.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you very much, Lee. I'm afraid I won't give such an optimistic note that you were wishing for, but somewhat optimistic for some people and very bad for other people. So it's more, my intervention will be more a cautionary tale of what happens when you try some EdTech intervention, in this case, as you mentioned, Hannah, messaging in a low literacy context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about joint work with my colleague Sharon Wolf at the UPenn. And this was work that we started during the pandemic, similar to the one that Lee just mentioned. So it was April 2020, schools all over the world were shut, and there was a huge unmet need in terms of educational needs. And everyone was trying to think about solutions that could be fastly deployed, that were cheap, and that could reach very many households, especially in remote rural areas. And Lee earlier mentioned that EdTech requires infrastructure. And this is one of the reasons why messaging is so appealing, because it doesn't really need a lot of infrastructure. Most households in Africa have basic phones that can take calls or receive SMS, in contrast to lower rates of smartphone ownership and also mobile internet connectivity. And so we thought to deploy SMS for these reasons. To target parents and support them, or hopefully we wanted to support them to engage with their children's education at home while schools were closed, and also in the transition to school reopenings. Also, one of the reasons why we decided to take this approach was that, as you mentioned, Hannah, there is now quite a consistent body of evidence that shows messaging is very promising in terms of educational outcomes. Of course, when we think about the evidence, for instance, from the Global Educational Evidence Advisory Panel that kind of summarized what was produced until they published this work in 2023, this evidence is very heterogeneous. So some messaging programs target teachers, other children themselves. In our case, I will be talking of parents. And what we did was taking an intervention that was already being tested, was successful in both Cote d'Ivoire and Brazil. And so we adapted to the context of Ghana, implemented it and assessed it through a large-scale RCT in rural areas of northern Ghana. These are the most disadvantaged areas of the country. There is a lot of subsistence agriculture and the biggest challenges in terms of education and poverty and food security are in these areas. And basically, we send these SMS reminders to parents with very, very simple tips on how to make their home environments more conducive to learning. For instance, some messages were trying to remind them to make time for children to study or devote to educational activities, or to foster the social emotional development through interaction. So, for instance, asking how the children's day went and talking more about different topics. So the findings were actually quite surprising. So we found that parents' educational backgrounds played a key role in the effectiveness of the messages. For those parents that had some exposure to formal schooling, and I'm not talking about higher secondary school, I'm talking about some years of primary or completed primary in most cases, for these parents, messages actually worked. Parents engage more with their children. We also collected data on children attendance to school as the school opened while we were doing the evaluation, and actually we found that kids were going more to school, and they also improved their social emotional skills. But this is the disheartening part of this story. For the majority of the parents in this setting, so 2/3 of the parents in our sample never been to school themselves. So for these parents, actually, messages backfired. We found that they engaged less with their children. The kids went less to school. Also, we found that parents lowered their educational aspirations for their children's education, and also became more skeptical about on the role, for instance, of school attendance for promoting children learning outcome. And so basically, of course, when we saw these results, we were shocked. And so we tried to understand what were the mechanisms behind these very, very contrasting findings. So with the survey data, we found that parental self-efficacy, that is the beliefs of the parents to be able to support their children's education, actually decreased for parents that had no exposure to formal schooling themselves. And this was really counter the theory of change for our program. Our program really wanted to empower them to support their children's education. We also collected qualitative data to really dig deeper in these findings. And what we found were two main things. The first one is that the nudges, instead of reminding parents about ways to engage with their children's education, actually seems that have reminded them about their own lack of education. And this made them feel bad about school. And so they disengaged. And the other very striking finding that we found in the qualitative data is that parents felt that they received this SMS because someone knew that they were not good parents. So it really made them feel bad about that. And actually, this finding is quite consistent with some evidence that is really coming up after, like in the last year. For instance, there is work in El Salvador and in India that show that these SMS nudges in very poor contexts where literacy low or where other stressors are very high actually backfire, increases anxiety, mental health issues around parents. So why am I here? Why I'm telling you this? Well, we can learn. So basically, we can learn from this experience. One thing is that the evidence so far came from lower middle income context, high income context, and even the studies from African context worked with samples with much higher educational level than ours. So it's good that we know what could go wrong in very rural, low literacy contexts, which are very common across rural areas of Africa and also Asia. So we really need to factor in the design of this intervention, how parents from different educational backgrounds can engage with these tools. Another aspect that I think it's key is that I think in this rural collectivistic context, community engagement is really critical. These are very collectivistic societies. And in fact, we found some suggestive evidence of spillover effects. So where more parents with lower or higher education were kind of together receiving these messages, the two effects, the positive for one group of parents and the negative for the other group, really seem to be magnified. So in our case, we couldn't really engage with the communities during the pandemic because of the restrictions for group engagements. But I think EdTech potential could be really boosted if communities are engaged and parents understand that the intervention is not to make them feel bad about their children's education, but really to support them. And then another potential aspect could be to couple these SMS nudges with other types of form of low-tech support, like phone calls, to clarify doubts or offer additional support. So I guess just some food for thought, and yeah, I look forward to the rest of the discussion and the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisabetta. Really interesting account. You know, we often speak about repurposing and contextualizing interventions as a cost-effective way to reduce upfront costs. But I think what you really highlighted is that context might really impact effectiveness. And you know, before I hand over to Joel, just want to say that it's often a delicate balance because, you know, the work I do is really with ministries of education. And I think they can find it a little confusing when we say that, you know, this intervention may work in this specific context and want to know, okay, but what does that mean for me? So, you know, it's about like, how do we balance that contextualization aspect and what works in one context with the effectiveness piece? So yeah, just throwing that out into the universe. Maybe we can address that at the end of the chat. But I know that before we do, my colleague Joel has really interesting insights from EdTech Hub's cost effectiveness work across our portfolio. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Joel.
Thanks, Hani. Yeah, like Beta, we were working in Ghana. I was PI on one of the Hub's research studies in Ghana, also using messaging and also in rural northern Ghana. And so that was how we first got to speak. And I think we were similarly attracted to the idea of looking at low-cost messaging as part of understanding, you know, is this really as cost-effective as people purport it to be? I think that, you know, obviously we've all seen the GEEP report, the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, best buys or great buys, and I think the idea that messaging, low-cost messaging, can be that sort of, you know, silver bullet is really attractive. I think we wanted to unpack what that really means in that context, and as Beta found in her study, we had quite mixed results. And I think that really spoke to me of, you know, how do we interpret that? How do you look at those impacts when they're sort of very minimal or quite mixed, depending on the population? And I think, you know, to me, one of the interpretations is sort of in the philosophy of nudge messaging. A nudge is only going to have an outsize effect if you're already on a tipping point, right? If you're already on a point of greater influence. So I think that really has to do a lot with the enabling environment, the context, and things which actually you can't necessarily impact by how you tailor messages, for example, which is one of the things we were testing. You know, can we make these messages better for the audience? You can't necessarily change it by some of the things that you're actually testing in that intervention if it depends on so much more around the context. So that was one of the things that we looked at in our cost effectiveness analysis of that study on messaging in Ghana. But that's only one of 15 studies within EdTech Hub's research portfolio, 15 large studies. We've commissioned many other studies that are smaller, both during the COVID window, where we also actually worked with Beta and Sharon Wolf on some other studies, and you know, in an ongoing fashion, we're engaging with researchers across the sector. But those 15 primary studies have looked at education in a number of different modalities, focusing on different sort of parts of the education ecosystem. And I think that's one of the real challenges with our cost effectiveness analysis within the hub is we're not just looking at comparing a learner-focused intervention to another learner-focused intervention. We're comparing interventions which are about teacher allocation at a systems level in Sierra Leone, and teacher professional development in Tanzania, and you know, personalized learning in Kenya, low-cost messaging in Ghana. There's a really wide range of topics and types of education. Some people would even say it's not really an education intervention in that it's not sort of pedagogically focused, but we're working in the whole breadth of the education space and trying to compare the different types of interventions and have some meaningful way of having a discussion around what is more cost effective. And obviously we know we're not comparing apples and apples. There's got to be a high degree of sort of nuance and contextualization. But I think it's still worth having that conversation. What do we learn about that comparability? And so within our portfolio, we've had a really rigorous, systematic approach to monitoring the cost effectiveness of each of our studies, both kind of commissioned internally within the hub, but also commissioned with partners like Open University, Harvard, etc. And applying the same criteria, trying to collect the same type of data to come up with figures that are at least part of the same conversation. And I think that's really important for moving forward in terms of cost effectiveness, is at least speaking the same language, being able to talk about the data in the same way. And in addition to kind of monitoring all of that and tracking the cost effectiveness data of those interventions that we've researched in our research studies, we are also doing some deep dives in thematic areas. So one of those deep dives was around low-cost interventions like messaging. And another one is around digital personalized learning. We've published both of these on our new cost effectiveness landing page. And these are ways in which we think, looking at a specific sort of vertical or class of interventions helps us to unpack a little bit more around cost effectiveness, what it is we're actually asking, and even problematize some of those categorizations. I think one of the things we learned with digital personalized learning, or personalized adaptive learning, as some people call it, is that it's really difficult to make it a coherent category. It's very difficult to say, actually, you can compare this type of intervention, which calls itself DPL, to this other one. Through our work in the Hub research study with IDU in Kenya, one of the key questions we're looking at is this thing which Lee brought up around scalability. And I think scalability and sustainability of DPL interventions, as they move from pilot scales to huge scale, national scale, etc., that's a really key question. And I think if we're not collecting data and articulating that data around cost effectiveness in a consistent manner, then it's very difficult to have serious conversations around, okay, what is this going to look like in 3 years or in 5 years? What is the kind of rate at which these devices are going to break down, for example? And that's really important to deal with that level of detail, whether it's about devices, whether it's about implementation, training, all of these things need to be captured. And I think for comparison purposes with cost effectiveness analysis, we've realized that you can't have a sort of one formula fits all that allows you to compare any two interventions. You have to be thinking about the staging and the sequencing of scale, so that we can talk about something that is at a regional scale, while also thinking about studies which are in our portfolio, such as the one on educational television, which is just coming to a close, using some of the Akili Kids programming, which Lee mentioned, Busara's work in Tanzania, which is actually spread across East Africa and beyond. So these are the questions that really, are at the top of our minds in cost effectiveness analysis. And clearly our sort of provocative question of, in the context of cuts, is cost effectiveness analysis the answer? There is no one answer, of course, and many decisions, sadly, are being made in the absence of evidence and on a political level. But I think one of the things that allows us to have a more serious conversation about that is when that data actually is representing the same things. I think when there's a distrust of the data that is presented on cost effectiveness, then people shut that out without even considering the merits of an intervention, the merits of the educational outcomes and the impacts that it may have. So that's what we're researching within our work, and I'm really excited that we're able to sort of present a lot of that research now as we're kind of coming to a close of a lot of the studies that we've been working on over the last 2 to 3 years. But I think we do find ourselves in a difficult position within the sector of not knowing how cost effectiveness analysis is being used, if it's even being taken seriously when people are making decisions, whether it's about cuts or just in a sort of general resource constrained environment. That's always on people's minds in decision making. So I think as we sort of transition towards more time for discussion and reflection between us on the panel and also you in the audience, I wanted to pose a question. Some things that have come to my mind just as we've spoken is in regards to scaling. I think Lee raised some really interesting points, and they're also embedded within the kind of intervention that Beta worked on, where if you're lowering the barrier to entry, like using SMS, where it's this is as cheap as we can make it. We've made it as easy as possible, in some ways. Then really what you're saying is you're prioritizing adoption, and I think that's something we've seen in other interventions. You mentioned 1 billion, Lee, and within EDU and other personalized learning, there is really this emphasis on, unless we get that level of adoption, unless we get that scale, it almost doesn't matter what the pedagogical input is. And I have a real, I have really mixed feelings about that. I think, if we take it outside of the world in which we're normally thinking, actually the two most successful education or EdTech interventions, globally, realistically, are probably Roblox and Duolingo. And in my mind, those are not actually educational; those are just games. But they're quite, they're in the education category in the app stores, etc. But do they actually have any educational content? And is that the danger of prioritizing adoption over the sort of value of what you are delivering once you do have that adoption? Is the danger that you end up just creating a viral game that ultimately doesn't really deliver on its sort of educational aspirations? And that's my sort of depressing point to open the discussion to you, Lee and Beta.
So, I mean, now Lee, Beta, any responses to what Joel just shared?
Lee, do you want to start, or?
Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I totally get your point, Joel. Oh, sorry, I have the OSPO slide. Okay, sorry, I had a. Yes, I think it's really challenging in terms of understanding what policymakers are expecting, and if we prioritize capacity versus efficacy. I think these two things should go hand in hand, because for like one key gap, I think, in the evidence is that too few evaluations really look at costs while they're trying to evaluate programs, pilot programs, but also programs at scale. And so we are lacking this information And then I guess the needle goes more towards capacity rather than thinking about what is the efficacy of the interventions. So I think there is a gap, and this doesn't help with the with prioritizing.
Perhaps just to add, like, I think that's a really good point, Joel, about scale and what we're scaling. Like, I think it's pointless if we have the best, digital personalized learning app that nobody is using, but equally, like, there are people who have figured out engagement, and it's making like YouTube shorts and it's TikTok, and these are the things that are grabbing attention, and they're not very educational. And so how far down that road of marketing do we want to go in order to grab attention and get people using products versus a product that is actually worth using? I think that's a great question. I'm not sure I have a great answer.
I guess the other issue is connectivity, right? A lot of these more engaging type of interventions cannot really reach most of the people that need it the most. So, for instance, thinking about rural Ghana, very, very few households have smartphones, and accessing mobile data is expensive. So you're even adding another barrier to learning and engagement. So I think at the end of the day, you're still cutting out a big chunk of the population that you actually want to reach. So it's really hard to and electricity is another one. So the question is really how leveraging, if we want to go, like if we want to focus on EdTech interventions, how we can leverage low-tech solutions, but also probably rethinking those in a way that are maybe more hybrid, that kind of combine in-person engagement with some EdTech support that, as Joel mentioned, really at the tipping point where you can really move the needle. But I think from this work in Ghana and other work I did, always in this context, in terms of parenting interventions, people really still prefer in-person engagement, and the EdTech part is kind of a plus to offer some low-cost support. But I think you cannot really think that with a messaging intervention you solve everything.
Can I ask another follow-up question? I thought it's quite interesting that we've all three of us have been engaged with relatively low-cost interventions in West Africa, Beta and I in Ghana, and you in Sierra Leone, Lee, and I've done some other work in Sierra Leone separately. But one of the things that strikes me about some of these low-cost interventions is that effectively they are a sort of glorified form of chivying. Chivying is a British word that I've learned as an American living in the UK, just sort of like basically hassling people, bothering them to pay attention to studying, or, send their kids to school. It's just basically reminding or nagging people to do things that they kind of know that they should be doing anyways. Is that a fair characterization of what a lot of the low-cost interventions are trying to do? They're just trying to remind people to do things that they already know that they should be doing, and they work because people already know that they should be doing them.
That seems, kind of fair to me, and I think that's ultimately, like, I don't think that's a special curiosity of the development world. Like, I think that's the way education works in England as well. You get these barrage of emails reminding you over and over and over again about the school homework, and there's the parents WhatsApp group where reminder about there's a thing on tomorrow. So I think in many ways, in a developed country, your life has all these reminders built in. Like, if you don't get your kids vaccinated, like, someone's gonna ring you, or someone's gonna chase you and make sure that it happens. And so it may just be chivying people along to something they know they should be doing, but that's fine, and that's useful, and people's lives are busy, and we should try to make it easier for people to do the right thing.
But also, I think these interventions could help building skills. Of course, not a messaging intervention cannot support parents becoming better parents, as we saw. But you could think about ways. So, for instance, in Ghana now, I'm working on a different studies in which we take this hybrid approach. And we basically combine some group meetings. So the standard of parenting interventions are usually group meetings. And these are, of course, again, are very costly to scale. There are pilots that show that work, but it's impossible to think that you could scale this. But what we are trying is having a fewer of these group meetings in which you support parents in learning new skills and practicing those in the group settings, which I think is very interesting for a parent perspective, because the group also gives you support and you can share your experiences and so on. So this is another dimension that I think usually in a tech intervention many times is missing, because you are alone with your phone and you cannot have that kind of mutual support that I think in a lot of cultures is very important, and I think is important in general for parents. But then you could have some kind of phone calls that help you to troubleshoot or that remind you, and again, quite a low cost. And then the SMS on top can then nudges and remind you to do some specific behaviors at the right time. So, for instance, when we know parents spend more time with their kids. So I don't think they necessarily should be about reminders. They could also support building new skills, but of course you cannot do at this kind of at the cost of one SMS only. You need to think about more creative ways to leverage different type of things that we know work.
While we're on this topic of, I think that there are a few points were raised, but just around, we compared messaging and what works, and say, Lee, you mentioned how it's used in the UK. Joel, you mentioned a whole question around whether it's chiving. And one thing that we have a question from the audience actually, which is linked to just this kind of comparison across different contexts. And the audience member says, something that worries me about too much focus on cost effectiveness is reduced holistic effectiveness, which sometimes just needs to cost more. So would the UK, for example, deploy the same intervention as a primary means of education in the same way many studies suggest for low and middle income countries? So I think the question is trying to ask whether we're putting the cost before the effectiveness, or how we're approaching it.
I mean, I think there's two approaches that, I mean, obviously, patently, some people are reducing how they define effectiveness so that it doesn't include some of those more holistic factors. But I think one of the things that's most important, especially in light of sort of decisions being made based on cost effectiveness, is to ensure that some of those holistic effects and holistic outcomes that are beyond sort of cognitive learning outcomes and beyond sort of bums in seats in schools, that those are actually also captured within cost effectiveness analysis. And that's one of the things that we would like to see in terms of how people think about cost effectiveness, that it does have multiple facets to it beyond just what your test scores are and years of schooling in a strict sense. But that's hard to do, of course.
It's always struck me as there's a few interventions which stand out as being extremely cost effective, including in the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel. They have these information interventions. And before that, we had deworming as being the single most cost effective thing, which always struck me as like a difficult thing to raise with a minister of education in a country that deworming should be the top priority. Like, what about the teacher training and the lack of classrooms and all of those basic bread and butter? It's always felt a difficult conversation to me, which I think speaks to this point about the marginal cost effectiveness versus what's overall more effective and what might just cost more.
So while we're talking about, this kind of comparison of cost effectiveness, I know that another question from the audience is asking how to accurately compare cost effectiveness data reported by EdTech studies, given there's a lot of ambiguity in the parameters in the calculation, where some studies may include the cost of hardware, software development averaged out, where others wouldn't.
So I think there are some norms emerging from JPAL and the IRC team and the World Bank as well, around methods for doing this and how to be comprehensive and to include all of these amortized capital costs. So I think there is some best practice out there, and would encourage people to take a look at that. It's a great and welcome, I think, development that more people are gathering cost data, whereas for years we had effects but no idea about costs whatsoever. It was done very very quickly and on the back of an envelope after spending huge amounts of time and resources measuring benefits.
And I think the other key thing in terms of costs that is beginning to change more with encouragement of kind of key players in the sector is that the only figures would be like budgeted figures, which is sort of notional. It's like, this is how much we thought we were going to spend on it, and we don't know what happened after that. It was just sort of things spiraled out of control. And I think it was World Bank's Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund. They did a real focus on this sort of disparity between projected costs and actual costs. And they said, I think every study, and these were specifically messaging studies in the previous CEF call, every one of them was like I think 60% over budget from what they had projected. So I think it's endemic to within the sector, but I guess maybe it's to human nature that we're like underestimating costs. And that's the sort of thing that always happens within public procurement of construction projects. People underbid, they underestimate costs, and it spirals out of control. We shouldn't be surprised that that happens in other sectors too, but there has to be some reconciliation after the fact. There has to be some gathering of actual data. Once things are spent, there has to be some sort of accountability around what that actually means. And I think one of the key things is there has to be some willingness to be transparent about the difference between how much the donor is out of pocket and how much something actually costs. Because I think a donor may be very keen to say, well, we paid this much for this intervention and we paid this much for this intervention, but it doesn't account for all of the sort of externalities, which, for example, one intervention may have had to pay from a different funding pot or from some other source in order to make it work. And I think that's a really challenging thing in terms of being honest about the articulation of cost data.
So I think so far we've talked about obviously cost versus effectiveness. We've talked about the calculations. Now we have an interesting two questions that bring us more into the realm of equity. I'll start with a broader one around what strategies and techniques are you aware of that measure the cost of equity, reaching the most marginalized, and the fourth E in FCDO's 4E model? So I think it links back to, what was shared earlier around lack of connectivity and all of that. So, I mean, I guess, what strategies and techniques are you aware of around measuring that? Or for interventions that may require more upfront costs?
I'd actually really like to sort of take this question and reframe it in light of something I know I've been thinking about, and I know you've written on in the past, Lee, is, we often talk about education in terms of learning adjusted years of schooling. That metric is based on something from the medical world, which is quality adjusted life years. And so within the medical world, that's based on a lot of underlying data, whereby, from an equity perspective, a certain sort of disability or something else that affects your life to a certain extent based on, you know, data that they've gathered from people whose lives have been affected by that, you know, losing a limb or partial loss of sight or whatever it might be. And so those metrics within the health sphere do have this kind of equitability component to them. Could we do something similar within education, where we have this sort of panel data which underlies lays, where, you know, you say, okay, well, for a learner with I don't know, partial sight loss, the difference in quality of life and quality of education of having this, you know, experience is proportionally greater than you know, the same sort of I guess output from a learner who has different abilities. You see what I'm saying? It's a bit of a strained metaphor, but I know this is something that you've thought about, Lee.
I think the big challenge for doing this is on the effectiveness and the impact side, we'll always try to look for heterogeneity, meaning different impacts on different subgroups. But your statistical power to do so is also always a challenge. You just need almost an order of magnitude bigger samples to be looking at lots of different subgroups. And so it's something that as researchers, I think we try to do, and it's just inherently challenging due to the statistics. And on the cost side, I think there's no reason why it shouldn't be possible to break that down by different groups and to look at additional costs that different groups might need for the program to be effective. And that partly relies on the design of programs, I think, and to the extent that they've planned in those details.
So I think, Lee, the second part of your answer helps unpack the next question I was going to ask. So I'm going to frame it with the question and see if you have any add-ons for this particular member of our audience. So the audience member asks, how can we ensure that that children with disabilities are not excluded based on cost effectiveness planning for EdTech, since making EdTech more inclusive costs more?
Yeah, I think that's a really important concern. I suppose we need to face the constraints that are there, that we need to make products accessible and inclusive. And so within those constraints, how do we design something that's as low cost and cost effective as possible? But yeah, I think we have to accept that is a constraint and try not to we try not to have decisions swayed by those factors. It's a big concern in many education systems around how you deal with people who need how you make proper provision for people who need more support. Yeah.
Absolutely. I know we have 2 minutes on the clock. If there are any final remarks from any of our panelists, and then I can close our session. No, nothing. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have over 100 of you joining us today. Joel has just shared that for any of you who have felt that your questions have not been answered, we have a cost-effective landing page that has an AI-powered assistant, but also please feel free to reach out to ourselves, anyone on this panel, for any more questions you might have. And thank you so much to our panelists for an insightful discussion around cost effectiveness in terms of their own research. And now we'd love to know what your key takeaways are. So as you can see on your screen, we have another poll for you. So we're nudging you to do some homework. So please do share with us what your key takeaways have been from the webinar. And we'd be keen to learn how you're going to be using these insights in your work.